Hello, everyone. I just wanted to provide a quick debrief about the empirical article review number 1 so that as you get started on working on the second empirical article review, you have some feedback from me. Let's start with the research question. I think for the most part, everyone was able to identify the two research questions that were explicitly stated in the research article. I think a key point that some of you brought up was also in the voice thread, not just in your actual write-up of the empirical article review, was how about kind of these issues of whether the research questions were explicitly stated, whether they were clearly articulated. But the other thing that I wanted to point out, as you think about being writers of articles, is that you also want to think about is that or is the research question or research questions sufficiently stated early enough in the article, right? And so you don't want your readers to be halfway through the literature review before they go, oh, okay, here's a research question, and now it makes sense given the literature review. You want to be able to state the research question early in the article and then use the literature review and the theory then to frame why that research question is important and how you want to answer it. Where I think the whole class kind of missed was really the task was to summarize the primary research question. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about why we should care about the primary research question. And largely it's because when you read research articles, and for this one, for example, there were two research questions, and some of you thought that maybe it was duplicative, others thought that it might have been too redundant or not clearly related to the first research question. So in that sense, understanding what a primary research question is helps you better understand how the multiple research questions, or sometimes in the research articles, they're referred to as sub-questions, how they all relate together. The challenge is sometimes the journal articles are not very clear about what the primary research question is. So they might not exactly say the primary research question is, and then we answer this primary research question by addressing questions 1, 2, 3, 4. So you kind of do have to read between the lines a little bit to sometimes understand what the primary research question is, but understanding that primary research question is what will help you understand how everything ties together. So let's talk about the literature review. Everybody did a really good job at talking about the literature review, but I wanted to highlight the importance of understanding the literature review as a way to place the study within that extant body of research. So Mike, for example, used the literature review and talked about how the literature review really helped contextualize the study within not just the watershed and environmental literature, but also in the context of the application, the IAD framework and the application of the IAD framework, and then also within the collaboration and partnership literature. So you can think about how that literature review is used to contextualize the study within a primary policy area, for example, but also in terms of thinking about the application of the theory or kind of the broader contributions to the literature. The assignment asks you to think about what is the most important point that was made in the literature review. And the goal of focusing on the most important point is that it really sets the stage for better understanding the research question and how answering that research question builds more knowledge in that particular area. So Nora, for example, focused on in that most important point of the literature was that there's lack of consensus and there are mixed findings, and so we need to do more work to better understand and to better kind of have a more definitive answer to that research question. And Renisha instead focused on, well, this is all that we already know about watershed or environmental partnerships, but what we don't know is the how of watershed partnerships. And so the research question is really getting at the how question because the literature has addressed a lot of the other aspects of watershed or environmental partnerships. Moving on to the theory. So I saw in VoiceThread that there were a lot of discussion about theory And as Tiara noted in her discussion, there really is no explicit theory stated per se in this particular article. And you're going to see a lot of articles that don't explicitly focus or apply a specific theory. And as we also talked in that first and second week of class, part of the challenge is that, we don't always have theories that can be applied in every specific context. So what you will see instead are frameworks, models, using the literature to hypothesize specific relationships that are instead used in empirical articles in public policy and public administration instead of a theoretical framework or a theory. The challenge with that then is obviously as you go from a framework to a model to hypotheses based on the literature, is that you're really your work, the research is becoming more and more and more atheoretical, right? And so at the end of the day, when you have null findings or you don't find results that support what you were explicating based on, for example, the hypothesis from the literature, you really don't have a theory to fall back on and say, but this is why it should make sense or it doesn't make sense. And so one of the questions that came up in the voice thread was whether IAD is a theory. And I think in this sense, we do want to defer to the original authors who are very clear that they don't say it's a theory, but they say that it's a framework. In this context, then, that doesn't mean that it can't be used to provide somewhat of a theoretical underpinning. And so if you think about what a theory is, you can think about, thinking about it as kind of a way to better understand the world, and thinking back to kind of the readings from the first and second week of class, a framework can still serve as a theoretical underpinning. It might not be as strong as a theory, but it gives you a logical reason, right, to understand connections, to understand relationships, to understand why how you want to answer that research question makes a lot of sense. So it's fine, I think, in a sense to say, well, okay, this article does not use theory per se, but it builds on some aspects of theory or relies on a well-developed conceptual framework. And in the case of the IAD, it's a well-developed and very well accepted conceptual framework for application in common pool resources research, in research to understand institutions, in partnerships, and to understand organizations. So in that sense, I think I would defer to the Ostroms and say, okay, IAD is not a theory, but it is a framework. And it's a framework that has a strong theoretical underpinning to help better understand specific types of issues. So for those of you who highlighted the IAD framework as the theory for your empirical article review, I think the other part that you want to focus on, that I want to remind you, is that it wasn't just the IAD framework that they were relying on. They were also using the IAD framework, and to understand the different levels of interactions, they used the levels of collaborative action framework that built on the IAD framework. And so here I want to pause real quickly and kind of mention that you're going to see a lot in the literature where there are frameworks or models built upon models or frameworks built upon frameworks. So if you're using a framework that's built on another framework, it's important to understand first that framework, but to understand the validity and the underpinnings of that framework, you need to go back and understand what are the fundamental assumptions of that original framework. So, for example, I do a lot of work on the theory of planned behavior, using the theory of planned behavior to explain how, for example, drivers decide to pay tolls, or to understand why people would support environmental decisions. But the theory of planned behavior is not by itself a standalone theory. Instead, it built upon some earlier work called the theory of reasoned action, or TRA. And so if I were to try to talk to somebody about the theory of planned behavior, I would still need to make sure that, how the theory of planned behavior was applied in my specific context would still be consistent with some of the fundamental assumptions of the theory of reasoned action. So in the same sense, then, with this particular empirical article that you reviewed, almost all of you talked about the IAD framework, but very few mentioned the levels of collaborative action framework that was kind of building on that IAD framework. And without the levels of collaborative action framework, you really wouldn't be able to tease out as much the differences across the different levels of analysis. A key part of the empirical article review was answering whether the theory was appropriate for the research question. And here I was really struck by kind of the different ways that you went about assessing that appropriateness. Ben, for example, used Wetton's questions from that second week of class about kind of assessing what is theory, what is not theory, to then assess whether the IAD framework was appropriate for answering the research question. Sage focused on, in terms of thinking about was this an appropriate theory, looked at how IAD explains the relationship between rules and outcomes, because those are the fundamental concepts within the research question. Oge, instead of looking at rules and outcomes, looked also at how institutions and how decision-making happened at different levels, and pointed out how the IAD framework allows a multi-level assessment. And also allows for causal relationships, and so that was appropriate for answering the research question. Mike brought up an interesting point, and that point was also brought up in the voice thread discussion about some possible limitations of applications of the IAD, because he was arguing that when you look at different types of partnerships, they have different roots or different origins and happen in different contexts, but the IAD does not address the origins and the context of those partnerships. So when you think about possible limitations of the application of a theory, then you need to think about how does it apply to the particular research question. And if you think that that research question really relies on a fundamental understanding of the origins and the context of partnerships, then the application of that theory might not be relevant. But again, I think it all hinges on answering that research question. In terms of the methodology, I think everybody did a great job. Renisha, I particularly liked the approach that Renisha took, where she looked at different aspects of the methodology, and from those different aspects then decided or analyzed whether that methodology was appropriate. So she looked at data collection, she looked at data analysis, looked at the different variables, focused on reliability and validity, some ethical considerations, and in talking about the appropriateness of the methodology for answering the research question, looked at some of the limitations. Nicole, I think, made a really interesting point, particularly kind of in understanding how this methodology might be appropriate for this specific research question, because she highlighted how these methods were appropriate given how difficult it is to understand and to learn about how group dynamics work, and so that the methodology that the authors used were appropriate because of the complexity of that understanding of group dynamics. A key point with the results is that you need to make sure that you link the results back to the research questions. I don't want kind of a summary of the results without thinking about how does this then answer the research questions. And Tiara did had a really interesting way in basically pointing to the different charts that summarizes the results, and to talk about how using that chart you can answer the research questions. Beth took a different angle to talking about the results, instead focusing on the implications for practice, which is also an interesting way to think about kind of contextualizing the results. However, since this is kind of a policy theory class, at the end of the day, what I was really interested in was your assessment of, was the theory useful for answering the research question? And so a lot of you talked very briefly about the utility of the IAD for answering the research question. I just wanted to point out one thing that Nicole had done was when she was talking about the results, she talked and talking about the results and the application of the theory in terms of answering the research question. Nicole talked about how she felt that the IAD was a very complex framework, but the article and the authors then took a segment of that IED framework and applied it specifically to answering the research question. And so then making that part of the framework much more relevant for answering the research question. What you're going to find also, though, in some other research articles, since you're going to get to pick the research article of your choice for the second empirical article review, sometimes if they're not explicit about a theory, and they might not even make mention of a conceptual framework, in your analysis of the results, that I think you need to also think about what would you conclude about the study as an atheoretical approach to answering the research question. Because there are very specific reasons why theory would be important for framing how you answer the research question. So in the absence of that theory, when authors take an atheoretical approach, what would be your conclusion about that atheoretical approach? So that's really it for my discussion about kind of the debrief of the empirical article review. I think overall everybody did a pretty good job. What I want to kind of stress for you moving forward for that second empirical article review is try and find an article that applies a theory that you think you might be able to use in your subsequent research over the course of your PhD coursework, or try and find an empirical article in a specific policy area that you're interested in. Don't just pick any random empirical article, but really think about how a better understanding of the theory in answering a research question that's of interest to you, or the application of a theory in a policy domain of interest to you, could be a building block for your own empirical work later down the road, like your comprehensive exam or your dissertation.